right, here we are with Muneeb Ali, co-founder of Stacks. Muneeb, it's so great to have you finally on the Defiant podcast.
Awesome to be here.
Yay. Okay, so obviously Stacks is one of the first layer 2s on Bitcoin. But can we just start with the basics and explain what Stacks is? Like, what's a Bitcoin layer 2, and maybe what makes Stacks special versus other layer 2s?
Yes, so I think a lot of people would be familiar with scalability limitations for blockchains, and I think Bitcoin, given the original sort of like the network, and especially given Bitcoin is really designed for decentralization, meaning that normal people on normal sort of like laptops anywhere around the world can actually run a full node of Bitcoin. That is very different from some of the other systems that we've seen recently. So Bitcoin really focuses on decentralization. That means that you cannot scale out Bitcoin. You cannot do millions of transactions on Bitcoin. And if a lot of people try to use the Bitcoin network, especially at the same time, the gas fees are going to go up a lot, right? And we have seen gas fees and scalability issues in Ethereum and some of the other chains as well. And there has been a lot of work, especially in the Ethereum ecosystem, for building L2s for scalability. So on Bitcoin, actually you need L2s for two reasons, not just scalability. We just talked about scalability. That's pretty sort of like straightforward, that if your transactions on the main L1 are getting very expensive, or they're just not enough sort of like bandwidth to pack those transactions on the L1, you want to sort of like build a new highway, right? It's like a highway that's getting congested, and you want to build another highway right next to it. And those are the L2s that can actually be faster, cheaper, they can have more bandwidth. And obviously there's a trade-off, right? Like they're probably not as secure as Bitcoin L1 itself, but they're going to be really good for some other things. And I think on Bitcoin, the second big reason, and this is the thing that not a lot of people fully understand, is that Bitcoin is not really programmable at the L1 level. The Bitcoin script language is very limited. You can only do a few things, and that's by design, because Bitcoin wants to be simple and durable as an asset class at the L1 level. So Bitcoin L2s become really interesting for Bitcoin programmability as well, right? So when you move your BTC from L1 to L2, now BTC becomes as programmable as Ethereum or as Solana. And I think that's a big advantage for Bitcoin L2s. Because remember that this has been a big criticism for Bitcoin in the previous years. People would say, hey, it's like a pet rock, you can just hold it. You can't really deploy it into smart contracts. You can't really do more complex financial instruments on chain around Bitcoin. And I think Bitcoin L2s are the answer to that. That no, you can pretty much do anything you can do with ETH or Sol. It's just that you can't do it on the L1. You would have to first move into the L2. That's not the case with Ethereum. Ethereum is fully programmable on the L1, and L2s are also programmable. But Ethereum L2s are mostly focused on scalability, not added functionality. On the Bitcoin side, I think the L1s are even more useful and even more valuable because they are also adding programmability and new functionality to BTC as well. The functionality that just did not exist before.
Right, of course. Okay, and then so Stacks is one of these layer 2s that's providing scalability and programmability to Bitcoin. Before we get into exactly how it's doing that, I'd love to get also your backstory. Like, how did you get into Bitcoin, and what inspired you to start Stacks?
Yeah, so I think my background is I'm an engineer, I'm a computer scientist. I did my PhD at Princeton in distributed systems. So for people who don't know what distributed systems are, they're basically large-scale internet systems. This is the research community that originally built the internet. And during my time at Princeton, we were focused on large-scale data centers and other types of protocols that would be used to scale out, systems at Google or Facebook or something, right? And honestly, I was sort of losing interest in that research area towards the end of my PhD. So I was supposed to graduate in 2013 and took a leave. And with my co-founder, who I also met at Princeton at that time, we were just sort of like hacking away on interesting new ideas, and stumbled upon Bitcoin, right? So it was sort of like early days of Bitcoin. I remember the time when Bitcoin would cross $100, and I would think it's too expensive. I would only buy it when it would like dip below 100, and that sounds like ridiculous now looking back. But I really think initially it was the technology that really attracted me. I've done a bunch of research work in peer-to-peer systems, and the fact that the Nakamoto consensus solved a very long-standing problem that was really attractive to me, and I sort of like dug into how it's working, how this consensus could be used for other things. And that was sort of like our first insight that payments are sort of like, one use case of this technology. And you can build other types of applications and systems using the same sort of like infrastructure as well. And that was super interesting. So me and my co-founder, we built an early system on Bitcoin. People might be familiar with ENS, the .eth names that people have on Twitter and so on. So the system we built, BNS, Bitcoin name system, actually predates that. It's still around. I think maybe 250,000 or more domains are registered on it. And we sort of like released that on the Bitcoin L1, which is sort of interesting that, it got a lot of traffic. Bitcoin core developers weren't very happy with us, very similar to Ordinals and Casey and the reaction he got recently. Because if you're trying to build things on the L1, you end up congesting the network. And a lot of people are like, hey, Bitcoin is not meant for these things. You're sort of like, sending spam on the network and so on. So that's how we got started. And those early lessons were really valuable because we discovered Bitcoin scalability limitations and programmability limitations sort of like firsthand by building on the L1. And that's when we started Stacks. So I actually went back to Princeton, finished my PhD. I wrote a different thesis. My thesis was now on like Bitcoin and blockchains and how to sort of like scale them out. So this was summer of 2017. And then we started Stacks, which is a Bitcoin L2. And Lightning also started around that time. And I think the one big difference between Lightning and Stacks is that Lightning is sort of like a state channel where it's only focused on payments. So it's not a blockchain. It doesn't have a virtual machine. You can't program anything there. It's just for payments. Whereas Stacks is more like it has a full chain history. It has a full virtual machine, and you can basically program anything on top of it. So that's kind of like the starting of Stacks, late 2017. We raised around $50 million back then to start off the project.
Awesome. And how did you, without getting too technical, but how exactly do you achieve more scalability and programmability on the Stacks blockchain?
Yes. So I think there are a couple of things here, right? First thing is that if you are building a L2, and L2s on Bitcoin are going to look very different from L2s on Ethereum, right? Because Ethereum itself is very programmable. Bitcoin L1 is not. So you can't sort of like, judge them from the same lens in a way, right? So on the Bitcoin side, one thing that was our goal was that can we use the Bitcoin existing security and the existing hash power that Bitcoin has to secure the L2, right? And that's actually coming to fruition now with this upcoming Nakamoto launch for Stacks. So the first version of Stacks went live in early 2021. And since then, developers have been working on a major release. It's called the Nakamoto release, and it's coming out in a month or so. So basically, after Nakamoto, 100% of Bitcoin hash power would secure the transactions on the Stacks L2, which is, I think, a really interesting property. So if someone wants to reverse a transaction that happened on the L2, they would have to go and attack Bitcoin miners and reorg Bitcoin, which is obviously very, very hard to do. So it's like the thesis that we have is that we want to reuse Bitcoin capital. Like, there's a north of $1 trillion asset, mostly sitting locked up in cold storage and other places and not actively deployed. So we want to make it easy to deploy that capital. And that's where our mechanism for moving BTC from L1 to L2 kicks in. So we call it SBDC. So the L2 BTC is called SBDC because obviously it has different security properties from your L1 Bitcoin. And then the L2 network is what I described, that is secured by 100% of Bitcoin hash power. And I think those two properties are really interesting, because when you look at some of these other ecosystems, over there, people wanted to do interesting things with blockchains, but they end up starting a new economy in a sort of like a separate ecosystem. It's like their own island, right? They're building their own island. They have to bootstrap it. They have to figure out capital. They have to figure out sort of like security budget for it and so on. Whereas what we are saying is Bitcoin already has $1 trillion of capital. Can we just focus on bringing that capital into the L2? Similarly, Bitcoin already has, the highest hash power and security budget out there. Can we just reuse that security budget to secure the L2? And I think that's how we sort of like stand out compared to like, any new L1 that someone is trying to start today, because it's like a massive kickstart, both in terms of security and in terms of the capital that people can use.
Is that the distinction between being a sidechain and being an actual L2? The fact that you are actually securing this network with Bitcoin hash power versus other networks which might call themselves Bitcoin layer 2s, but they're actually a separate chain that are maybe confirming some transactions to Bitcoin, but not securing their network with Bitcoin hash power? Is that kind of the difference?
Yeah, so I think this is a sort of like a highly debatable topic, and it really depends on the definition you're using, right? So in Ethereum, the definition sort of like boils down to two things. One is that the property of unilateral withdrawal, meaning that if you don't trust the L2 at all, can you get your funds out by just talking to the L1? So in Ethereum, you can at least theoretically do it. Practically, there are all sorts of like gotchas and other cases and so on. But at least theoretically, you can force your assets to be withdrawn out of the L2, which is a really good property to have. And I think on the Bitcoin side, a Lightning can do this, because Lightning is simple enough that it's sort of contained within Bitcoin script, and users can withdraw their funds. Again, there are certain attacks that can happen, and the devil is always in the details. But Lightning, for example, qualifies using that definition. The second thing is when people say that, hey, your execution is sort of like verified by the L1, and that's where rollups and fraud proofs and those type of systems come in, where the claim is that, look, you can actually submit a fraud proof on the L1 for the computation that is happening, right? So that's the Ethereum lens on what an L2 is. And then if something is not qualifying, they call it a sidechain and so on. On the Bitcoin side, there aren't any rollups live on Bitcoin yet, because Bitcoin needs some additional tooling, maybe some additional opcos, or maybe things like BitVM would be able to do it, but that doesn't exist yet. So you can't apply that definition that because Bitcoin is a different programming environment, right? So that's why we focus on the finality side of it. That if you can't reverse a transaction without attacking Bitcoin, I think that's a very strong property, and that makes you an L2. Also, the term is, I think there are historical contexts here. The term L2 was used in Bitcoin before Ethereum even existed, right? So you can't come on afterwards and have a different definition of the term and then say that they apply that definition, right? Like Bitcoin culture predates Ethereum. The term L2 was used, like Liquid is a federated network, and it's been called an L2 since forever, like since literally before Ethereum even existed. So I think that the definitions are different on the Bitcoin side. Over there, L2 is the broader term, and I actually support that. That I think it's a broad term. Let's not fight over it. If Liquid, which is a federated network, is an L2, most other things are L2s. But then you can have more specific things, like Rootstock calls itself a sidechain, right? People can debate if Stacks is a sidechain or not. But I think then that's a technical sort of like debate on what the definition is. So I think this topic gets heated often because people think that you're trying to sort of like hype up the properties of your system. So I think the thing that I would focus more on, and that is, are people being upfront and completely transparent about the security properties that you're getting. So on Stacks, like we are very extremely upfront and clear about the trust assumptions and security properties. That when you're moving your BTC from L1 to L2, the when you're moving it, it's a decentralized sort of like trustless way of moving your Bitcoin in. But on the way back, you are trusting this decentralized group of signers, right? Yes, those signers have an economic stake. Yes, some of large institutions like BitGo and others might be signers, but there is trust there. So you can call it trust minimized, you can call it a decentralized signer set, but it is not completely trustless, right? And that as long as that is very clear, then whatever term you use for what Stacks is, like it sort of doesn't matter that much, because what people really need to understand is that what are the trust assumptions that I have when I move my Bitcoin from the L1 to the L2.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so you said that in the Nakamoto update that's when you'll have all of the Bitcoin hash rate securing the Stacks network. So right now that's not the case, right?
Stacks has a separate security budget from Bitcoin in the first version, and that security budget depends on the Stacks market cap and miners and so on. But after Nakamoto release, it's basically that security budget will only matter in between the Bitcoin blocks. So right now, let's call it roughly $1 billion of STX capital is locked in consensus. And after Nakamoto, that capital would be signing off on the transactions that are happening in between two Bitcoin blocks, right? So let's say 10 minutes or max 40 minutes or something, whatever the average time in between Bitcoin blocks is. So let's say you did a BTC transfer on the L2. So that $1 billion has signed off that this transfer is fine. For most cases, like that's fine, right? Like that's how Solana works, or that's how Ethereum works. Like the validators have signed off that your transaction went through. But as soon as a Bitcoin block comes, now it's Bitcoin security and Bitcoin finality. Someone will have to go and reorg Bitcoin to be able to reverse your transaction. I think that's a really, really interesting property. Also, it's a massive upgrade to the UX of Bitcoin, because right now when you do a transaction on Bitcoin L1 or even Stacks right now, the L2 only produce blocks when Bitcoin produces blocks. So it's very slow, like 10 to 40 minutes. And that's a massive UX improvement for Bitcoin usage around the world, because people can have fast, cheap transactions which are fully reliable, and you can send as much money as you want. Right? If you compare this to the Lightning Network, you still have to figure out liquidity. You have to figure out routing paths. If someone wants to send $10 million, right, you're likely not going to find enough liquidity on the path. But that's not the case with Stacks. It's fast, cheap, and you can send $100 million if you want to, right? You don't have to think about it, and it just works.
Nice. So, what else are you expecting to come live with Nakamoto? No, this has been in the works since 2021 or so.
So I think I would say early 2022 is when the initial design started coming in. So I think 2021 was like a growth phase for Stacks, right? A lot of developers came, a lot of users came, and then we started hitting the bottlenecks. Our mempool was always full. Devs and users were basically like, hey, we need more capacity. Like our transactions aren't going through. People were complaining about the slow block times. And I think that's where a lot of researchers, including myself, started putting our heads together for, hey, what's the next version of this system look like? And I think the white papers came towards the end of 2022, I believe.
So what are kind of the big milestones that you're expecting?
Yes, so I think the system is going to go live in a series of hard forks. One of them has already happened. So that's the Nakamoto sort of like, part one. If you remember the Ethereum upgrade, there was a time when capital started getting locked in consensus. So I think we did something similar where, $1 billion of capital unlocked from the legacy system, which is the current system, and got locked in the new system in a hard fork. And that went smoothly. Everything went fine on the live network. And right now we're in between part one and part two. Part two is where the full consensus sort of like kicks in and people start seeing the fast blocks, which is what everyone's sort of like waiting for, because that's the bigger step for the Nakamoto launch. And I think that's effectively, I think by the end of August or so, the developers will pick a Bitcoin block. Usually that's how hard forks happen. So they pick a Bitcoin block, and those numbers are typically based on these 2-week cycles. So Stacks has these 2-week cycles for locking your capital. So there, you typically have to wait a cycle or something to pick a block. So we'll know by the end of August what exact Bitcoin block but the launch will be, and then SBDC is the next big thing, and it's rolling out in 2 steps as well. First V1, where the signer set is a little bit more limited, and then V2, the signers are open to everybody, and anyone can come and participate in the system.
So the major milestones are full security derived from Bitcoin, faster blocks, and SBTC. Is that right for Nakamoto?
Yes, okay. and I think after that, one of the big things that I'm also very excited about is WASM is going live on Stacks. So that would actually make so Stacks has a different programming language called Clarity. It focuses more on safety. So it's a very sort of like precise and safe programming language. It's basically decidable, meaning that even before running a contract, you know exactly what the contract can and cannot do. You know exactly how much gas fee is going to use. It's a very precise, safe language. WASM will make Clarity much faster, so that would be like a speed improvement. But another benefit of WASM is that it opens up the possibility of having other types of language interfaces as well. So one of the things that our current developer community is very excited about is potentially having a Rust-like interface to the system as well, which I think it's basically one of the things I've heard is like, hey, people really love Stacks. The developers who are actually in the ecosystem, they really like Clarity, but maybe the funnel of new developers coming in could be a little bit limited because it's a new language and people need to learn it. But I think with a Rust-like interface potentially down the road, you can actually attract a lot more developers to the ecosystem. So that's another thing we're pretty excited about.
Nice. And what's the timeline for all this?
So the WASM work is sort of like, I would say, close to a testnet release. Let's see exactly when it comes out, but that'll be pretty exciting because WASM itself is, I would call it, half or more than half of the work in getting there, and WASM would speed up the network and has all sorts of like other benefits. So that's one thing I would be watching out for. When is the WASM testnet coming out, and then when is WASM going live on mainnet, which would likely be after Nakamoto and SBDC and all that. And then the Rust work can be done in parallel, where effectively when WASM goes live, it opens the door to having the Rust interface to it. And I think that's a parallel work stream. So we'll see. My personal guess is, expect in the order of months or quarters after Nakamoto and SBDC are live, because these things are pretty complicated to push them to mainnet.
Do you expect all of these changes will be live on mainnet by, I don't know, Q4?
I think Nakamoto and SBDC are much more defined right now. Mm-hmm. I mean, Nakamoto is already code complete. SBDC, all of the Clarity contracts are written. Just testing is happening. So I think those are, we can have much better estimates. On some of the WASM and Rust work, like it is not as well defined right now. So I think we'll basically like follow up. Also because most of the developer attention is on the other two things right now. So I think once those launches happen and bandwidth clears up, I think some of the developers will start looking more on the WASM and Rust work, and then I think we'll have better estimates.
Hey everyone, I'm Ilya, and I'm inviting everyone to Bangkok, November 9 to 11.
You've been duped into thinking anything decentralized was ever gonna work. There's a better way. Stop wasting your time with all this blockchain and go back to the norm. Get a latte and stop trying to change the world. Oh, and this thing in November, Redacted, the hackathon, they're cushy office jobs out there, Everything is working as it should.
For our special event, Redacted. We're going to dive into AI, we're going to dive into Web3, chain abstraction, decentralization, and user-owned AI. I'll see you there.
Out of curiosity, so when you were in kind of in the very early days of stacks and programming on Bitcoin, you created VNS, so kind of the limitations of Bitcoin. Did you ever look to Ethereum and wonder, why not build there? Like, what prompted you to stay building on Bitcoin?
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. I would say there are two factors. One is actually they're sort of like they're sort of like the same thing if I think about it. I would say that I am fundamentally in a different camp from Vitalik in terms of what should the foundations of this blockchain architecture should look like, right? And interestingly, there have been these camps in other historically in other fields of computer science as well. I'll give you two examples. If you look at early days of even microprocessors, there were two types of architectures, and they're still around. One is called RISC, reduced instruction set, and the other is sort of like complex instruction set. And different people like those architectures for their own reasons. So I'm in the camp of the reduced instruction set architecture, which means that the base layer needs to be very, very simple. It should just do a few things, and it should do them really well. And then you can build more complexity on top of it. And Vitalik is the opposite, right? The base layer is actually very complicated. And interestingly, there are recent blog posts that Vitalik has written where he's sort of like questioning that assumption that, hey, Ethereum really needs to figure out, does it need to be simple like Bitcoin, or does it need to be more complicated of a platform, right? So that's sort of like one example. If you look at the internet itself, the TCP/IP layer is extremely simple, very basic. It actually hasn't changed in the last 30, 40 years. And that's the world that I come from, where the foundations have to be very simple and basic. And I think Bitcoin has that. Bitcoin is, compared to Ethereum or Solana or anything else, extremely basic, extremely simple. It does one thing and it does that thing really well. And I think then you can build more complex things on top. So for me to sort of like go and start building on Ethereum will be the equivalent of abandoning my entire sort of like, beliefs about computer systems and how they should be built and go and build on something that I fundamentally sort of disagree with, right? And I think that's why I would say I was building on Bitcoin even when not a lot of other people were. And I think slowly people are coming around and realizing that this might be a more sustainable long-term way of building things.
So yeah, there's this argument on the kind of Ethereum versus Solana communities, which is like the monolithic chain and the like rollup version, or like the rollup future, or like L2 enabled future. And it's a bit similar to what you're describing, where it's like these two worldviews, but basically kind of the monolithic chain that Solana, this vision that Solana is arguing for is like, if you need to scale via so many rollups and so many layer twos, you end up making all these security trade-offs and UX trade-offs. And in the end, just the user is worse off than if you're able to just from the get-go start off with a blockchain that's programmable and scalable and does all the things. And so, Ethereum would be somehow kind of closer to your camp in this kind of argument versus Solana, where they're saying no, like, Ethereum has these basic properties, but like all of the extra stuff can be pushed to layer twos. Where do you stand there?
I would say that Ethereum would have been in this camp if the Ethereum base layer looked very different. Let me give you an example. So if you think about Bitcoin just does one thing. It is the money layer, right? It's money. It's starting off as money, 21 million cap supply. Everything else about Bitcoin is optimized for just that use case, right? Why is Bitcoin decentralized? Because for a network to have global adoption, a normal user should be able to run a full node and verify that the balance in my account actually is what it is, right? Like everything else in Bitcoin is optimized for that one use case that we are just trying to define a money supply and have it distributed. If you look at Ethereum, that's not the case. They are not picking any one thing. If you look at Celestia is focusing on just DA. Bitcoin is actually not a data availability layer. Some people are using it as a data availability layer, but I think it's a horrible, in some ways, data availability layer in terms of how expensive it would be or how slow it would be and so on. Yes, there are certain benefits you can have, like, you can store hashes on it and verify that data, but it's not designed as a DA. Celestia is designed as a DA, and it's the only thing that it does. So I think the issue with this argument that I see is that Ethereum is actually not picking a lane at all, right? There's the ultrasound money thing going on where it's changing its monetary supply to be money. Well, to be money, you first have to be stable and durable, right? Like at the rate that Ethereum actually changes, it's very hard for people to store their assets there and believe that Ethereum is going to look the same 5 years from now or 10 years from now or 20 years from now. But Bitcoin is very clear. Bitcoin is pretty much going to look like it is because it optimizes for durability. Same for DA. It's not optimizing for being a DA layer. Ethereum is likely going to get rid of a lot of the state that it has. It already has probably, right? Like the stuff that was written in Ethereum 5 years ago when it was like a proof of work network. I'm not exactly sure how to retrieve it, like what type of archival nodes I need to run and so on. So I think that's what I mean by Ethereum is not picking a lane, and it's also not simple at the base layer, right? So it would make sense if Ethereum, let's say, stopped being a DA layer, stopped being like full smart contract platform and just optimized for, hey, I'm going to have the best support for L2s. That's the only thing we're going to do. That's a very different Ethereum. That means there isn't Aave or MakerDAO running on Ethereum L1 because that's needless complexity. You only have the operations to support L2s, right? Like that's not Ethereum. So I think that's where I think the analogy sort of breaks down, and I think that I actually think that's a bigger problem that Ethereum needs to figure out than anything else, because it's not picking a lane. It's not focusing on because when developers go to Solana, at least things are simple and clear that, hey, it's just a single chain, it's fast and it's cheap. Yes, you can criticize it that it's not going to scale or it's very expensive to run nodes and so on, but at least it's clear what lane are they picking and what bet they're making.
What do you say to like the Solana argument that chains like including Bitcoin that need layer 2s to scale are just like compromising on security and UX, and in the end like it's just better to have this like monolithic architecture?
Yeah, so I think over there what I would say is that most of the Bitcoin supply is going to remain on the L1. Like Bitcoin, going back to like Bitcoin is designed for one use case, like making BTC the asset as durable and as safe as possible. So I think most of the Bitcoin asset is going to remain on the L1, and that's serving its purpose, right? I don't think Bitcoin needs L2s for BTC the asset to become dominant in the world. It's already happening. Bitcoin doesn't really have functional L2s right now. Like Stacks or Lightning are very small fraction of BTC usage right now. Not anywhere even close to like not even 1%, right? Like not even 10% or 1% or so on. So Bitcoin is doing fine and is dominating, right, as it is. I think Bitcoin L2s are sort of like a way for almost like using a hot wallet when you compromise on security a little bit compared to cold storage, but you can do transactions. And then the idea is always, once you're done doing whatever you were doing and you want to store money for the long term, you'll come back to the L1. That's not Solana, right? Solana, people go there for the actions. They're not going there to store their money, right? Like Solana is an application platform. the base use case is I want to go there, I want to do some transactions, I want to do some usage. That's not the base case of Bitcoin. I think base case of Bitcoin is it's money, you store it. But think about, money that you have. Most of it is actually in your bank accounts. It's just sitting there, right? Like you don't carry everything in a wallet. I think L2s are like that. Like you carry small amounts of it in your wallet, you use it, but the vast majority of your money will remain on the Bitcoin L1.
So your vision for how Bitcoin develops in the longer term is Bitcoin L1 continues holding most capital, most assets are on layer 1, and layer 2s are a way to put that capital to work to perform transactions. But then, when you're ready to hold those assets again, they go back to L1.
Yeah, and I think that actually sort of like fits pretty well with how the world works currently. Like even if you look at real estate, right? Like the amount of real estate that sits idle is far greater than the amount of real estate that's being transacted in any given day, right? Like most people are not selling their house any given day. I think only a fraction of that asset is actually liquid and moving, right? So L2s are for liquidity and movement and applications. Some people might want to earn a yield on their BTC and they might want to deploy that. But some of the capital might remain on the L1. L1 is also the settlement layer, right? So it's like you do all of your transactions on the L2, but they settle down on the L1. So that removes trust from the L2. If something goes wrong in an L2, the L2 can revert back to whatever state the L1 says it was supposed to be at. And I think that's a very different system. If you compare to Solana, whenever Solana halts, how do people decide where to roll back the state to, right? There are a couple of developers. I've heard rumors that there's actually a Google Drive that has the latest version. It's the trust level is actually very high in terms of there's no source of truth. When Solana halted, how are people deciding which version of the chain we are rolling back to? That's very different here. Like the source of truth, the ultimate truth is Bitcoin L1 always. And the L2s are settling on it, at least Stacks is, right? So if something goes wrong, let's say Stacks L2 halts for some reason, like people can argue between, okay, are you going to Bitcoin block number this or Bitcoin block number that? But at least it's very clear and transparent what that state of the world looks like. So I would say that this model of division between the L1 and the L2 and sort of like specifying what the L1 is supposed to do and what the L2 is supposed to do is actually pretty unique and pretty interesting. Whereas, again, bringing Ethereum back in, like in some ways, if Ethereum L2s really take off, then Ethereum has needless functionality at the L1, right? Like there's functionality that you basically don't need at the L1 level that's there. And in some ways, it's making stuff more complex and sort of like adding to the confusion.
Protocol 20 introduces Sorbonne, which is Stellar's cutting-edge smart contracts platform. This creates new surface area for innovation and provides new opportunities for developers to build protocols and products that create access to everyday financial services. So it means a gradual increase in transaction capacity and a chance to fine-tune applications. And it's the most transformative upgrade to the Stellar network to date. Woohoo!
So at the end of the day, for you, is Bitcoin still money? And then programmability on L2s is a way to provide additional functionality for that money. And just like the distinction with maybe ETH, and I know there's like different definitions for it, but in the end, ETH, I think, functions more like, the initial kind of white paper, like gas for a world computer, for like this, internet, like blockchain-based internet, right? So it's like gas to fuel all these different applications, which would be different from like what I'm hearing your vision for Bitcoin is, which is like more strictly money related, like financial application related, not just like any application on the internet.
Yeah. So I think, again, these are two different schools of thought. And I think, I don't think people actually talk about this enough. And I've had a lot of discussions with people I respect in the Ethereum world about it. But I think people should at least understand what the two schools of thought are, right? So on the Bitcoin side, the argument is you start with money. That's the most important thing. If you get that right, everything else will happen. Yes, sure, you have to build these dev tooling and L2s and infrastructure and so on. But the focus is you have to get the money part right first. On the Ethereum side, the argument is if you build a thriving ecosystem of applications and developers and people start using ETH will eventually become money, right? So the people that I respect on the Ethereum side, they would argue that look at all the NFT trading volume. That's what ETH is being used as money already. Fair. And then they will be like, look at all of the capital that's deployed in smart contracts, and look at like what capital is being used, what is being used as money. It's Ethereum. Fair. And I think the argument on over here is if you get the money part right, bringing a technology like an NFT marketplace to money is actually trivial. And I think Ordinals showed that. When as soon as NFT marketplace was available for $1 trillion of money, right, people quickly started trading it. And I think the NFT trading volumes on Bitcoin very quickly reached the levels of Ethereum. Right. So that's like a one example we've seen. We haven't seen that in DeFi yet because Bitcoin L2s, like even stacks, like Nakamoto is not live, SBDC is not live. So we don't have a place where people can deploy BTC as capital in DeFi. And I think once they're able to do that, my argument is that people are holding Bitcoin as money already. It's winning in the real world. They aren't holding ETH as money. They're holding it more as either a bet on Ethereum, the technology, or actually for paying gas fees, right? I hold ETH right now for mostly paying gas fees for stable coins, right? Like that's the use case. And I've held Ethereum in the past as a bet on the technology. I was part of the original ICO. I think it was like 30 cents or something. But I no longer do because I think if I want to bet on a technology, I would rather bet on Solana right now because it is at an earlier stage. It is sort of like, has more room to grow for that particular category compared to Ethereum. But I hold a lot of Bitcoin because I hold it for a very different reason. I'm not betting on Bitcoin as a technology. I'm actually holding my savings in an asset class. And I just don't view ETH that way, right? For me to view Ethereum that way, Ethereum would need to look very, very different.
But isn't holding Bitcoin, for like its properties as an asset class and so on, I think that's different from holding Bitcoin as money. Like you hold, I don't know, like I don't see, I think your argument is super interesting. Like Bitcoin is money first and then all the applications will follow. Ethereum is doing it the other way around. I think so. I think that's right. But to me, Bitcoin hasn't achieved that either. Like hasn't achieved the status of actually money. I think people who hold Bitcoin are still holding it as a bet on the technology or like the asset, like as an investment.
Very interesting point. Let me dig deeper into it. Right. So let's say my argument is that how I hold Bitcoin, and this is true. I hold it as a savings account. Right. I do my savings in Bitcoin. I've been doing it for 10 years now. And when I'm doing savings in Bitcoin, your savings account, I'm not actually looking at any metrics, any metrics for, hey, what's the transaction volume on Bitcoin? How many developers are coming in? Is the network growing or not growing? Those things are irrelevant to me, right? Like it doesn't matter because it's like when you keep dollars in your savings account, you're not actually measuring anything, right? It's just money.
But are you making payments with Bitcoin?
If I have to, right? If I have to, I liquidate some of my holdings. But what I care about is, are my BTC holdings in BTC going up over time or not? That's the rule for savings. Hey, are my savings growing or are they not growing? The network stats are irrelevant to me. when people want to invest in ETH, they're actually looking at how many developers are building on Ethereum, how many applications are there, what's the usage number, what's the gas fees, right? Because they're looking at it as more like, I'm sorry to say, but like a tech stock, right? Like Ethereum as technology is like a tech stock, and they want to see how is the technology performing, especially relative to Solana, to Avalanche, to everything else. Bitcoin actually has no competition in my mind. Like there's nothing out there where it's just money, it's just savings, and I'm actually not. So it's irrelevant to me how many transactions were there on the Bitcoin network.
But I think that's just to you specifically, right? I think, like I don't know, like I think most people holding Bitcoin will hold it like similar to a tech stock as well. Like if you ask any of like the ETF holders,
I would disagree. At least the large holders of Bitcoin that I know, they explicitly do not hold it as a tech stock, and the reason why they put Ethereum in a different category is because they consider that a tech stock and they don't consider Bitcoin as a tech stock. I think there's a really good paper by this guy John Feffner that came out in 2017, and a lot of the large holders of Bitcoin that I know, they actually follow that school of thought. So I would highly recommend people to look at that. I know that an average person, they might confuse the two assets. I can totally see your point there, that for an average person, it's like, hey, numbers go up, numbers go down. They are two different things. I might allocate here or there, but I'm talking about very large, very sophisticated people who clearly differentiate the two assets, and there's like very, very little confusion there.
Sure. I don't know. I think that might be true for like very large ETH holders as well, that they see ETH as like their savings, and they view their ETH stock as like number of ETH they're holding.
Yeah. So I think that's a really good point, right? So I think those people are probably the same people who realized that ETH will need to win as money against Bitcoin, and they were part of the Ethereum is ultrasound money movement and so on. So then the argument would be, I would just take that hey, let's take the ultrasound money movement in Ethereum and compare that to the sound money of Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin just dwarfs it, right? The amount of people who actually understand Bitcoin as sound money versus, I think the ETH as ultrasound money has skeptics and critics within Ethereum, right? It's not a very large movement. It's not something that's like gaining traction.
Yeah, especially because it's become like inflationary again, and like it depends on like gas usage, of course. Yeah, I guess like for Bitcoin to finally actually be money, like it would have to, I don't know, have like more velocity, be used for payments or not. Like, do you think like it can be considered money and just be used for savings? Or like, do you think that like the payment side will come from like stable coins on Bitcoin?
Yeah, so I would say the savings comes first, right? And then for payments, like the work that we are doing with Nakamoto, I think it's going to help a lot. Like once you can do like cheap, fast Bitcoin payments, but Bitcoin has the problem that because Bitcoin is in a price discovery phase right now, people don't want to sell it. So it might be stable coins that are settling on Bitcoin for security that people are using for payments. But even direct BTC payments, I wouldn't rule them out because let's say initial attempts like on Lightning and others didn't take off, doesn't mean that you can't have a lot of BTC-based payments, especially small payments, if they're fast and cheap. I don't think those technical solutions are there yet for Bitcoin to be used as payments. And just like going back to, you start with money, I think on the use case here, you start with savings technology. And I think if that is taking off, at least in the Bitcoin community, I think there's a diehard, very large community who do savings in Bitcoin. Their sort of like life goal is that, hey, I want to have at least X amount of Bitcoin. I want to sort of like work towards it. And they hold it for a very, very long time period. I think that's where it's starting. And I think then as technology improves with Stacks Nakamoto, possibly other L2s, where it becomes super easy and cheap and fast to do these things, and dev tooling, right? If it's easy to integrate BTC payments in a in a website. I'll give you an example of our work. Like there's a wallet, Leather, in our ecosystem, and it's sort of like the first Bitcoin web wallet. Like imagine there weren't even Bitcoin web wallets around. Like MetaMask has been around for such a long time. How would you even make a payment on a website if there isn't an easy web wallet that just pops up and you can just sign the transaction? So I think Bitcoin infrastructure is lagging in so many ways, and yet Bitcoin is still so strong out in the market. So I think in the last couple of years, there was a lot of valid criticism that if no one is building these tools for Bitcoin, no one is building L2s, no one is building these wallets, then at some point, Ethereum has a shot at just dominating and eventually winning as money as well. So I think the recent year or two where we have seen developers come in, build L2s, build wallets, build infrastructure tooling, dev tooling, I think that argument weakens now because there are clear signs of life on the developer ecosystem. Obviously, it still remains very small compared to Ethereum, but I think there are very healthy signs of life now, which I think is something very that I'm personally very excited about.
Yeah, no, it's been amazing to see all the growth and development on Bitcoin in the past year or so. And so speaking of that, like there are different developments in the kind of programmability front with BitVM and OpCat, kind of the discussion around bringing back this like ability to add like scripts to Bitcoin. Where does Stacks stand on this? Like where does Stacks get its programmability, and are you looking to implement BitVM once it's launched, or like where do you stand on all these different developments?
Yeah, so I think BitVM is effectively a way to potentially have more trustless bridges and potentially have fraud proofs based L2s on Bitcoin without making any changes to the Bitcoin L1. So I think it's very, very exciting, but it's at an R&D stage. Like we actually announced some R&D effort to push BitVM research forward as well. And where we stand is like these things are not going live in the next 18 months or more. So our work on SBDC, we are very confident that it's the most pragmatic, decentralized, and secure way of moving your BTC right now. Like we have more than 20 institutions like BitGo, Figment, and Blockdaemon, and all these other players who are signers on the network. It's a very decentralized signer set, and it's, I think, the state-of-the-art technology today that works today for moving your Bitcoin. If approaches like BitVM mature over the next 18 months, we are already doing R&D on it. That's an upgrade to our bridge that can be done at some point in the future. But you really need to get traction on the L2 and have a lot of users and developers. That's the thing that matters. I think the technology can get upgraded, especially when it's at a very early R&D stage right now. Same with OpCat or other changes to Bitcoin. They historically take a long time. I think there's some support for OpCat. One thing I do like about these proposals is we are sort of converging on, how Bitcoin is so, we talked about this earlier, how Ethereum does a lot of things, and maybe Ethereum needs to focus on just being a really good L1 for supporting L2s. That's what that's the direction Bitcoin is going in. It's already very simple. Everything is disabled. You can do very few things. But people are talking about what opcodes would enable trustless L2s on top. Maybe it's OpCat. Maybe that's enough. Maybe we'll need something else, like some snark or Stark verification opcode directly in Bitcoin. We might get there, but my timeline for that is like 5+ years, at least for like direct ZK verification on Bitcoin and opcode to do that. But maybe OpCat is enough, right? Like because people are able to do a lot with very small changes to Bitcoin, but still, from a Stacks perspective, we are watching it. We're not blocked on it. We have already always had that design principle to never require any changes from Bitcoin L1 because it takes you a lot of time and effort to get those changes through, and you can't be blocked on it. So I think you build the best L2 with how Bitcoin is today. Assume it's not going to change. If it changes, great, right? Like now we have more functionality to play with.
Okay, super interesting. And then the question of rollups on Bitcoin.
Yeah, I think I would say similar. That I'm very. I think I view this as like Bitcoin should ossify at some point, meaning completely stop changing. Doesn't mean Bitcoin implementation wouldn't change. I mean the protocol, right? So implementation, if you're improving the Bitcoin mempool or you have a faster way of transacting, sort of like broadcasting your transactions, sure. But that's implementation details, right? Bitcoin, the protocol, I think should just ossify at some point. But the last thing we would need is really good support for trustless L2s. Because once you have that, then there's no need to change Bitcoin anymore, right? All the experiments can happen on L2s. And so I look at rollups from a similar eye, that if you have really good support for rollups, then all the scalability and programmability can come from these L2s, and you don't need to change L1 anymore. But I think we're far from it right now. Like these things take time. They're very complicated. People are trying to approach from different directions. And my experience building in Bitcoin has been that it always takes longer. Typically in computer science and engineering, it takes longer than you think. But in Bitcoin, like you can add more factors to it, because getting any changes into Bitcoin is a very, very long process.
And then to start wrapping up, I loved your thoughts on what's needed for more DeFi to develop, or for more DeFi activity to happen on top of Bitcoin and maybe stacks specifically. So I was looking on DeFi Llama, some of the most active dApps on stacks, and there's a liquid staking dApp, stacking DAO, there's a DEX, lending. So there is like some DeFi activity, but looking forward, like how are you seeing that will develop? Like what's needed for that activity to increase?
I think the biggest things that are needed are sort of covered in Nakamoto and SBDC. So the first thing is actually speeds. If you talk to sophisticated DeFi folks, they would tell you that having that unpredictable block time between 10 to 40 minutes is sort of like a showstopper for them. Right? You need predictability. Even if your blocks are like 10 seconds, that's fine, but they need to be predictable at 10 seconds, so people know what to expect. Right? So the slow block times and the unpredictability of block times is a big blocker. And then it's BTC capital, right? So without SBDC or other ways of bringing your capital in, remember that L2s are only useful if they can bring in a lot of BTC capital. So I think that's sort of like the biggest thing for DeFi. The third thing is something that's already happening in the ecosystem, is just like integrations, like bridges to other ecosystems, from Bitcoin L2 stacks to others. Stable coins and other things, but I think that's sort of like number 3 on the list. The first 2 things are fast speeds and BTC liquidity. And I think once that starts coming in, some of these other integrations are sort of like already in the pipeline. And I think that's what's sort of like needed for DeFi to take off.
And then lastly, so right now there's, just looking at the latest numbers, there is, say, roughly 48 billion of TVL on Ethereum DeFi, while there's only a bit more than 500 million on Bitcoin DeFi of TVL. Do you? I mean, I'm guessing from our conversation, you're definitely betting on Bitcoin TVL, like DeFi TVL, to beat all of the other chains. Is that right? And if you could guess or have an estimate, when do you expect that to happen?
Yeah, so I think I sort of like discard the numbers right now, because it's a little bit like, before ordinals, what was the NFT trading volume on Bitcoin? Yes, there was counterparty, and there were some other protocols that were doing it, but before ordinals, it was basically nothing, right? And after ordinals, it's up there. So I think the Bitcoin DeFi numbers are going to matter once there is an L2 that actually starts getting traction in terms of DeFi. I think the analogy would be and people are attempting multiple L2s, right? Stacks is one, but there are a bunch of others that are coming up as well. I think the analogy would be that, let's say, pick the top 10 L1s outside of Ethereum. At that time, when Solana was starting off, people didn't know that Solana would be the place where, a lot of DeFi activity would kick off. There were so many other competitors as well. But the probability that at least one of them will get a lot of DeFi activity outside of Ethereum was actually pretty high, right? And that's actually what ended up happening. Solana ended up being the place compared to something else where a lot of activity is actually happening. I think Bitcoin L2s are sort of in a similar place where, let's say, there are 10 plus high quality projects that are in the pipeline. Stacks is sort of like the leader right now, has a lot of market dominance. And the probability that, none of those are going to get DeFi, BTC DeFi going is actually pretty low. I think something is going to take off in the L2 space. And it's just a matter of time. And I think whenever we see that L2 that's actually getting a Solana-like traction, but this will be with BTC capital, right? So that's when Bitcoin numbers for BTC DeFi are gonna start going off. Kind of similar to Ordinals. There were counterparty and other types of NFT protocols before as well, but Ordinals was the thing that really hit, and the capital was always there, right? Like BTC capital was always there. So I think it's a similar dynamic for L2s. Whichever L2s ends up attracting the BTC capital, I think that's when the stats will start to matter. Because before that, I think it's a game of like building the right protocol and the tooling. And the numbers you can just discard the numbers. I think they're just so small that they sort of like don't matter right now.
Yeah, super interesting. When you say that Stacks is a leader, is that in terms of like market cap versus like your token versus others, or like what specific stat are you looking at?
I think it's like developer traction. It's sort of like how mature the stack is in terms of, we've been around for years. It's sort of like the only blue chip asset as well. So in terms of if let's say you're a large company and you want to now go and integrate with an L2, some of the newer projects might just be too small for you to even consider, or they just haven't been around enough so that they don't have like their security risk profile might be too high. I know, for example, a lot of large DeFi funds who want to deploy capital in L2s, but they're like, hey, we're not going to work with something that's not in CoinMarketCap top 50. And Stacks is the only L2 that's actually in CoinMarketCap top 50. And there are good reasons for it, right? Like the amount of liquidity, the amount of integrations, like a lot sort of like goes into having a more mature asset in an ecosystem versus not. And I think sometimes some things just take time. So that doesn't mean that, hey, Stacks will always be there. Nothing is guaranteed. I think there's a lot of competition. And I think the way that we are thinking about it is a lot of these L2s are actually EVM based. So, and we are not doing that, right? That's a conversation for another day, but we are not touching EVM. I think the EVM L2s will sort of compete with each other, and some of them might emerge as like a winner in the EVM category. But we are going for a new stack, totally sort of like integrated with Bitcoin, and attracting a different profile for developers who like Rust, who like, safe languages, and who want to come and build. So I think that's sort of like our long-term differentiation in terms of being an L2.
I know we're coming up on time and a little bit over, and thank you for taking a bit longer, but just so interesting. And if you want to just quickly summarize why you're not going on the EVM route, just super curious to hear why.
I think EVM at this point is like 5 years old, maybe more technology, and there used to be an argument that, hey, if you're not EVM, you're going to have a hard time building a developer community. I think Solana has just completely thrown away that argument, that they have a thriving developer ecosystem. People actually like the Rust-like languages. A lot of senior developers, like the developers that I respect, even in our ecosystem or broadly speaking, they're all really attracted to Rust these days, right? It's a language that I enjoy programming in. Right? So I think it's something where you just have to listen to your heart. Like I've always hated EVM. I think it's clunky. I hate programming in a JavaScript like environment. And I think there are a lot of other people like me. And Solana sort of like proves the point that, they're not EVM. They built a dev ecosystem from scratch on a more modern tech stack. And I think something like that can be done for Bitcoin. And I think we can be the more modern tech stack as a L2 on Bitcoin. Whereas if you're an EVM, you're also not differentiated in the market at this point, right? There are 20 other Bitcoin L2s that are EVM. What's your differentiation? So for those reasons, I think, and the last thing is that a lot of developers in our ecosystem, they truly believe in decidable, safe programming languages, and EVM is the opposite of that, right? So it's Turing complete. It's very hard to sort of like know what the program is going to end up doing, not doing. And if you look at modern sort of like research in programming languages, a lot of people are trying to go towards decidable languages, and clarity is already there. Like in our dev ecosystem, we have 2 years of data that the developers in our ecosystem are very sticky. They really love building here once they are able to come in. So I think we have to listen to our developers. We have to sort of build in a way that is that makes them happy, versus sort of like losing our existing developer base and losing the type of people we are attracting by going to EVM. It's sort of like we talked about like two different schools of camps a bunch of times, and I think EVM is just a different school of camp from us.
Awesome. And then final question, for those who want to get started with Stacks, what should they do?
I think it depends on if you're a developer. There's a dev tooling company called Hero. They have some of the best dev tools. You can go check out their platform on hero.so. And that's the easiest way to get started, sort of like building on Stacks. If you're sort of like, general community and just curious, you can go to stacks.co, and it has a lot of resources about the ecosystem, what's going on, how to get involved, what are the different startups building in this space, and a timeline of sort of like these upcoming launches that everyone is very excited about.
Well, that was amazing, Muneeb. Thank you so much for taking the time. Love learning more about Stacks and excited for what's coming up.
Awesome. No, I really appreciate your question and sort of, trying to get more information out for why I think the way I think.